in the British sector was one particular individual who was the focus still very much of how the four powers in Berlin reacted towards each other, and that was Hess. He was the final remaining prisoner in Spandau prison, which was actually right near one of the British military barracks. And we had extraordinary plans for what to do in the event of Hess's death. Now, many people, there were many attempts on his life, and there were many diplomatic incidents about how he was being treated, whether one should speak to him or not, and so on. Because as far as the Soviets were concerned, they wanted to have a say in what happened to Hess and his body when he came to die. So if I were to tell you that the plan for Hess's death was about 150 pages long, translated into, obviously, English, French and Russian, that you had to have a doctor from every nation present, that the Allied power that was in charge of Berlin for that particular period, and I ought to explain that, there was a rotation between each of the four powers as to who actually was overall in charge of what was happening in Berlin, although the Soviets never ever actually exercised it. But as far as they were concerned, they had authority over what was going to happen to Hess if it was their turn to guard Hess. And whoever was in charge of Berlin for any particular month was also in charge of guarding Hess. A couple of little tales about that in a minute. So, 4 doctors. The senior doctor would be whichever nation was in charge of Hess at that particular time, would conduct the autopsy, confirm that it was him, make sure that he hadn't been poisoned, make sure that the arrangements for the disposal of his body were in accordance with the Allied Kommandatura, which was the four-power agreement, that all the press and publicity was going to be handled by the nation that was in charge at that particular time, including what you could and couldn't say and when you could and couldn't say it. No interviews. It was all one-way traffic, because the lid had to be kept on the final member of the Third Reich who was still in our care. And of course, when I say in our care, he was very much in our care. And every month there was a changing of the guard. And after the changing of the guard, the Allied general, should he so choose, or his representative, which could have been me, and I was only a major at the time, or one of the diplomats, would actually go and check that Hess was happy with his cell, with the facilities he had, his television, his exercise regime, or whatever. It was quite extraordinary. And he was quite an extraordinary man as well, actually. I mean, very intelligent, articulate, and actually completely without rancour. I mean, he knew why he was there, and certainly I found that he didn't begrudge anybody anything. He'd been part of a system, and he was still alive. He was still alive, and I think he died in my successor's time, so probably 86 something, 87, 88, something like that. The Allied Kommandatura in Berlin was hysterical. It was a massive building. And once a month, the 3 Western generals would formally meet with their bevy and entourage and all this sort of stuff, and formally note that the Soviet general was not present. I mean, formally you invited the Soviet general every single time. And whilst it seemed anachronistic and a bit of a showpiece and a bit of a process and all this sort of stuff, it was actually really important to do it. I had an opposite number called Stiopkin, Soviet opposite number called Stiopkin. The American was Tom Page, and the French changed on about every 3 months from what I can make out. And Stiopkin was an incredible guy. I mean, very sophisticated, Georgian actually, of course, which would not go down well in Russia now. Spoke fluent English, deeply interested in what was happening in the West. And we used to have a little bit of fun, I have to say, at the expense of the Americans, who were very process-oriented. So when you'd had your lunch with, when you'd had your handing over of Hess, and the Allied Commendatura would have met before that, you then sort of saw Hess, and the Russians handed over to the Americans on one particular occasion, and I think that was the order. It was Russians to Americans, Americans to French, French to us back to the Russians. You had this lunch in Spandau prison, and the Russians had produced the tiniest bloke from Kamchatka, a tank officer of about 5'1", and the Americans had produced 6'6" of Texan meat. And quite clearly, this is the Russians taking the rip, and the Americans, as they used to say, fighting on the frontiers of freedom, standing tall, being proud. Get into the lunch, and I've got the American on one side, American young officer on one side of me, and the Russian young officer on the other side, Stuart directly opposite, and the Americans, and it was a junior lunch in the sense that there were no senior officers present. And the little Russian, Georgian chap said to the Americans, "So Chuck, where do you come from?" And the American says, "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information." And Stiopkin looked at me and said, "Over to you, James." So I said, "Hey Chuck, where do you come from?" "I come from Texas, sir." So I relayed it on, and of course, absolutely oblivious to the irony of everything that was going on around it.